there's a kind of like unwillingness to acknowledge the role that, Western populations have had in inflicting certain policies on themselves. And because they don't want to deal with that, it's easier to just blame Jews. And so that at least comes up quite a bit. And I know I don't really want to get into like current day campus politics and discussions around like Israel and Palestine and what's happening there. But you can see that reflected in some of the current events that are happening at the time that we're recording this, where there's a lot of Jewish narratives and responses to Jewish narratives coming out regarding the change in the demographic composition of America's universities and the culture in general, and Jews receiving, grief on the back end of that, and what led to that. So let's get into now the claims about liberalism, multiculturalism, and immigration. One of the other tenets of Macdonald's theory is that Jews were heavily involved in these as intellectual movements, and therefore this is a pillar in the group evolutionary strategy. What is your response to the claim that, if you look at, the history of, let's just start with lots of mass immigration, right? Open borders movements. There are a lot of Jews there, or multiculturalism as an idea. How do you respond to that?
So, in the papers I've written, so I've looked at the history, for example, of the 1965 Immigration Act in the United States, which led to mass non-white immigration. And so Emmanuel Seller is probably the person who, on the JQ side, is most associated with this bill. And the idea, Macdonald claims that he and the Jewish activists who wanted to do away with the quota system, which had limited immigration from various European countries, to avoid. The purpose of these quotas, by the way, which had existed before 1965, was to keep out Southern and Eastern Europeans.
Right.
Wasn't
right. The Europeans they didn't like.
They said so. It didn't apply to other areas of the world, and the quotas were often ignored for various reasons. I mean, it was legislation that just was not working at all, and most Americans. And then because of the new sensitivities about race after the civil rights movement, these policies had become quite unpopular. So most Americans wanted to get rid of the quota system. But it was more as a symbolic gesture, because the people behind the act, they had no idea what the consequence was going to be, especially because they created the possibility of family reunification or chain migration. So one family member comes and the other family comes. And they didn't know what was going to happen. And this is well documented, including in the sources that Macdonald himself cites, particularly in Hugh Graham Davis's book, which Macdonald treats as authoritative, and then cherry picks some quotes to make it sound like Davis is blaming Jews. So this was the quota system had to go for various reasons. The Johnson administration had this as a priority, and people didn't have experience with what chain migration and what would happen, and how there would be a flood of immigrants. And they were convinced that it wouldn't change the demographic status quo, They would, they'd bring in, 100,000. They naturalize 100,000, Chinese, and there'd be maybe some small change in immigration, but they just couldn't imagine what the result would be, and especially what the result of exponential, growth would be, because people are not good at thinking about exponential growth.
Right.
And there's an interesting illustration of this. A few weeks ago, or a few months ago, I tweeted about how Japan now has a very large immigrant population, especially among the younger generation. In Tokyo, especially, it's like, I think 1 in 12 people in Tokyo, young people in Tokyo, is foreign born, something like that. So then I tweeted, this is going to catch up with them. It's going to, in a few generations, Japan's going to look very different. And then a lot of people who I'm quite sure I'm the kind of JQ right. So first they were accusing me of celebrating this fact.
Right.
Because I said, this is the fact. They said, oh, that means you, the Jew, of course you want that. But I didn't say. In fact, I would suggest Japan, if they're listening, I suggest the Japanese think carefully before they do this. But I'm just saying that's the fact. But people are saying it's only, it's only a small number. So even these people, who I'm sure many of whom would say that Emanuel Seller knew exactly what was going to happen, they're seeing the exact same situation. It's actually much more obvious in the case of Japan than it was in Seller's time in 1965, and they can't see what's going to happen as a result of exponential growth of the foreign population in Japan. But Japan it's going to be way less Japanese, and as time goes on, eventually it's not going to be the same country. So you see how even now people just can't understand how this works. Now, eventually, replacing white people became a goal, right? So now that's considered a good thing in itself. But that was not the case at the time when these policies were made. And so now maybe, I mean, to the extent to which open borders is maintained specifically because politicians have the goal of changing the demographics, or to the extent to which there are other reasons, just inertia, or business interests, a kind of desire to avoid confrontation, and these are all factors that are contributing to open borders. I think that certainly a lot of politicians who are responsible for making and enforcing immigration law are aware that immigrants tend to vote a certain way, and that colors their attitudes toward immigration. I'm quite sure that's the case. But we didn't start down this road, at least in America, because Jews or anyone else specifically wanted to make America non-white. There isn't an iota of evidence to support Macdonald's claim that that was what happened. As I discuss in the final paper, still no evidence for a Jewish group with evolutionary strategy, Macdonald completely misrepresents some quote or some fact about Seller to make it sound like he knew that, or that he wanted to make America non-white. Completely untrue. I give the sources. I give the original quote in the paper. You can go and see it. People can go and see it for themselves. Now, in Europe, Jews have generally been far less influential in recent European history than they have been in America. I mean, Jewish influence is strongest in, Israel 1, America 2.
Yeah.
Maybe like UK's 3rd, but you're starting to get the distant 3rd, really. In countries like Sweden.
Mhm. Yeah, right.
They're like you count the Jews in the thousands. Um, so there's this. So I know I have to say that. So everyone's going to say, well, what about Barbara Lerner Specter? Right. So there's this, I think, originally American woman who moved to Sweden, and she started this kind of book club for a few women to talk about politics. And she made a statement that's replayed constantly about how Jews are playing a role in the transformation of Europe, or something like to that effect.
Yeah.
Some random woman making this statement, which is held up as proof of the conspiracy, is ridiculous. Would be recognized as ridiculous in any other context. If I show an example of a random white woman admitting that America is a white supremacy society, these same people who see Barbara Lerner Specter as the spokeswoman for the Jewish conspiracy obviously wouldn't accept my evidence that America is a white supremacy because this one white person said so. And in fact, I could find 50 million white people who would say that America is a white supremacy, and even 50 million wouldn't make it so. And the other ridiculous argument made is that Sweden is under the thumb of the Bonnier family, so they own a media company in Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
But the Bonniers started intermarrying a couple generations ago. Now, one of the largest shareholders in the Bonnier group is a bishop in the Church of Sweden. They have no interest in Jewish matters, and they're not even involved in running the company. So, okay, but so people who want to blame the Jews will continue to do so. But those are the facts. And Sweden is more liberal. They're more in favor of mass immigration than anyone else, much more than America. So, and there are other countries which are similarly more woke, more open borders than America is, where Jews have way less influence, or basically none at all.